Okay, yeah. I think now is the appropriate time to start. I'd like to start first of all with an acknowledgement of country before we begin. So I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. For the University of Sydney, which the Critical Antiquities Network is currently located, the traditional owners are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. And I particularly would like to extend to them the apology for the perfunctory insincerity with which this acknowledgement is routinely given. As practitioners of critical antiquities, we are only too aware of the tremendous gulf between what is said and what is meant, and it is a poor substitute for justice. However, we acknowledge them nevertheless. So with that out of the way, I'd like to turn to our final speaker for semester one. Of course, Tristan and I have a program in the works for semester two, but it's wonderful to be able to introduce Tom Geue from the Australian National University to round out our program for semester one. Tom is perhaps needs no introduction to those of us at the University of Sydney. Tom is, after all, an alumnus, an undergraduate alumnus of the University of Sydney. I'm also, very proud that he's also an alumnus of the same high school as me. We went to the same high school, although, considerably many decades apart. But Tom is I think it's not a stretch to say that Tom is a force of nature in the study of Latin literature at the moment. Having graduated with a PhD from King's College, Cambridge, Tom has worked at Trinity in Oxford, at Bristol, at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He's the recipient of a Leverhulme Prize. He's researched and published with Harvard and spent a very lucky considerable amount of time at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. And he's recently been able to come back to his native country and take up a post at Canberra at the Australian National University, where he is currently lecturing classics. Tom has two books, I think that's right, and one edited book that's just come out. Am I doing you justice there, Tom?
Yeah, that's it.
Your PhD, I think, published as Juvenal on the Poetics of Anonymity in 2017. And then the work that came out of your Harvard stint was Author Unknown, The Power of Anonymity in Ancient Rome. And then you've got this edited collection with Elena Giusti, Unspoken Rome, Absence in Latin Literature and its Reception, with Cambridge, that's just come out. So, there's a lot going on with Tom, and it's very exciting. Tom works...
That's like something my therapist would say. Sorry.
Right. Tom works in early imperial Latin literature, poetry particularly, but he also works wonderfully at the nexus of critical theory and studies of antiquity, like we do. So Tom is a close colleague with ours in the Critical Antiquities project, whose work intersects with ours a great deal. And of course, we're very lucky to have him as a contributor in our forthcoming edited collection as well. Tom is in fact going to speak to us today on the subject of the book that he's currently writing, which has the same title, I believe, or at least the working title is the same as the paper that you're giving us. So this is very exciting, fresh material, which is great. And this is the fruits of the work that you've been doing at the Scuola Normale in Pisa on the great Italian materialist philologist, Sebastiano Timpanaro. And so I'll stop now and cut to you, Tom, and let me introduce Tom Geue with Major Corrections, The Materialist Philology of Sebastiano Timpanaro.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for that really kind introduction. And I too would just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am today. I'm living and working on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present as well. And I too echo Ben's sentiments about acknowledgement as a poor substitute for justice, but it's nevertheless, it is something we do, and we do happily. I also want to thank Tristan and Ben for this invitation to participate in this series, because I think this Critical Antiquities Network has genuinely become one of the world's most interesting forums for critical antiquity and its reception. And I just give so much kudos to Ben and Tristan for getting this up and running. It's such an amazing thing on the Australian stage, but also on the world stage. And I'm just sort of humbled to be able to participate in it. Last time, for those of you who came to the last talk by Sarah Deribo, Sarah was doing a book launch, and I think her talk sort of encompassed a lot of the things that Ben and Tristan are sort of getting at with this project and this series. And these two things might be summed up by their concepts of, critical antiquities as about using antiquity as an object for critique, or treating antiquity as an object of critique, but also using or taking antiquity as a kind of standpoint for critique. And I thought Sarah Deribo encompassed that really, that spirit incredibly well. And I also noticed that Sarah actually used a lot of the techniques of traditional philology, things such, things that to us have seemed sort of part of the furniture, such as historicism, the way that we try to kind of read ancient texts and view ancient art on its own terms, and sort of how, and I think Sarah did a great job in showing how those tools of the traditional philologist can be used for progressive ends. And I think that's kind of also what I'm interested in this talk today. So just to give you a bit of a backdrop before I get going on this project on Sebastiano Timpanaro. Back in the day, I discovered Timpanaro probably sort of about 20 years ago through the kind and enlightened advice of my beloved mentor, Francis Muki, who I think I saw in the Zoom room. Francis suggested that I read one of Timpanaro's works, and ever since that time, he's kind of stuck in my head, festering away as this kind of very interesting and singular thinker. But it sort of took a friendship and a collaboration with my colleague at St Andrews, Henry Stead, to sort of bring some of these things to light. So when I was in St Andrews, Henry was just publishing his great work with Edith Hall, A People's History of Classics, which is about sort of working class receptions of classics in 18th, 19th century, mainly England, but also Scotland and Ireland. And this, and Henry was also starting his project on classics and communism, which is still ongoing and is an amazing thing. So I thought with this project on Sebastiano Timpanaro, who is a philologist and a Marxist, I thought I was going to kind of fit in with Henry's project. I thought I was going to do something that might participate in what Henry was doing. But then I sort of realized that this wouldn't be a very good reception project. And the interesting reason I discovered when doing serious work on Timpanaro is that his work on antiquity is almost completely unaffected by his politics. And that might be something we want to talk about later on. So this wasn't a case of kind of, an Antonio La Penna or even, a de Saint Croix, doing sort of Marxist inflected readings of ancient material. This was actually sort of, in Timpanaro's case, the other way around. I was noticing how much his philology was getting into his political and other intellectual activity. So the book that's ended up emerging from this is actually not really pitched as an intervention into classics or classical reception. It's more, I've tried to make it more of a kind of intellectual history or a kind of intellectual biography. It's about showing the impact of philology on leftist intellectual history. And the book is going to be coming out with Verso at some point. I've done a second draft of it now, so hopefully sometime in the next year. And so the talk I'm giving today is kind of a taster, designed as a bit of a taster for the book. It's meant to give a sense of Timpanaro's philology, but also a sense of how this philology sort of contributed to other spheres of his intellectual and political life. And the book eventually, the book has chapters on sort of all the other things that, all the other spheres in which Timpanaro contributed. His studies of 19th century Enlightenment classicism in Italy, his studies of materialism, his absolutely virulent anti-Freudianism, studies on 19th century linguistics, and then also his kind of non-attempts at literary criticism, with all of which we can sort of talk about later. But today we're going to be a bit focused on the philology. So we've also posted a handout. Tristan kindly posted a handout in the chat. So that contains just a handy summary of all of Timpanaro's work. And I'm going to be referring to some of those works a bit, and then it also contains some passages and the Italian of the passages that I'm going to be talking about. So let me just share that screen. Okay, after long preamble. If I ask you to imagine a classical philologist, you're probably going to fail to imagine anything much at all. If I remind you that classical philology is the study of the manuscript history of Latin and Greek texts, the form and content of what they say, and the finicky minutiae of their interpretation, your mind's eye might materialize the vague outlines of a bespectacled, tweed-jacketed, scruffy-haired old prof puffing a pipe in a smoke-filled turret of some mouldy Oxbridge college. Emphatically, you would not picture a polemical Marxist militant agitating at the vanguard of Italy's post-World War II leftist march. And if you grudgingly accepted that both those profiles could jostle paradoxically within the one person, you probably wouldn't countenance that such a person could also sport, in the great political historian Perry Anderson's words, one of the purest and most original minds of the second half of the 20th century. Nevertheless, Sebastiano Timpanaro, 1923 to 2000, was the unlikely broad church housing within him all these unlikely permutations, and then some. But the question is, how can a philologist and Marxist ever meet? Isn't classical philology the discipline of the disengaged nitpicker, beavering away in a field of microbial humanities, seemingly standing infinite levels of magnification beneath the huge concatenation of material forces we call politics? Well, Timpanaro, one of the 20th century's greatest practitioners of this art, oddly tended to think that it was that. Timpanaro was trained in one of the most eminent hubs of classical philology at a moment when its centre of gravity had swung towards Italy after a long 19th century tarrying in Germany. In fact, his particular breeding grounds, the University of Florence and the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa, under the monumental and all-shadowing professorship of Giorgio Pasquali. Here he is in one of my favourite photos. Don't know what he's doing. Pasquali, during World War II, laid claim to the inheritance of the best German philological tradition of the previous generations. While Timpanaro never worked in a university due to his crippling neurosis around public speaking, he always considered philology his central métier, the thing he was actually versed in, as opposed to the bouts of intellectual, what he called dilettantism, he would engage in over the rest of his wide-ranging writing career. He maintained a constant philological activity, even in parallel with his day jobs, first as a teacher at various middle schools around Pisa in the late 40s and 50s, Then from 1959 as a corrector of proofs for a small Florentine publisher, La Nuova Italia. I've given you a Timpanaro, a famous Timpanaro book published by La Nuova Italia. You can see it here on the side. So he worked as a corrector of proofs for this small publisher, which partly actually inspired the character in George Steiner's novella or long short story called Proofs, which was about a character, a proofreader, philologist character, and communist based closely on Timpanaro. Now, Timpanaro may not have ever had a university chair, but the philological establishment recognized him as one of their own. He was elected to the British Academy as a corresponding fellow in 1975 and as a fellow of the Accademia dei Lincei in 1989, which was one of Italy's and Europe's oldest and most prestigious academies. Okay, so the field of philology respected Timpanaro, but sometimes he doesn't return the favor. Sometimes he seems a bit embarrassed by the field. Philology, in Timpanaro's view, takes away precious time from political struggle. It languishes as a kind of micrology, a study of microscopic minutiae. And such self-deprecation as this is sort of part and parcel of Timpanaro's evergreen rhetorical positioning as minimal or marginal. He described his main volume of collected philological work at the bottom of that slide there, the minor writings of a philologist with no major writings to his credit. Timpanaro's protestations of philology's minorness quarantine it from his more ambitious forays into politics, culture, history, psychology, and philosophy, which fold under his competing self-description as, in that top quote, a kind of speechifying populist pessimist materialist of the late 19th century brand. The small and the big, philology and politics, the twain in Timpanaro's scheme must never meet. They would instead have to settle for a juxtaposition without meaningful unity. Now, what I want to do in this talk is to show that Timpanaro wasn't entirely right about the missing overlap between these different spheres. Philology equipped him not only with an intellectual toolkit he would draw on again and again for all his subsequent activities, but its history, its methodologies, obsessions, filters, its worldview supplied him with a distinctive means of sense-making that would express itself differently in all his subsequent work. So what big things can this small field teach? And in this moment of long overdue reckoning for classics, at a key juncture of building and rebuilding a discipline fit for purpose, a collective project spearheaded by some incredible thinkers and speakers in this very seminar series, what of philology's histories might we want to keep? What of its less told stories might we want to usher onto the ark? How should those of us dissatisfied with the constraints of our discipline try to take it beyond itself? At the risk of making you listen to one more white man droning on about another, I hope to convince you today that Timpanaro's is a legacy worth thinking about as a precious and precarious contact point between a field that seeks to interpret small bits of the world and a practice whose point is to change the whole damn thing. So first things first, let's step back a bit to introduce a few aspects of this singular character. Sebastiano Timpanaro Jr. Came into the world in Parma in northern Italy in 1923. His birth sort of almost perfectly timed with the advent of Italian fascism the year before. His mother, Maria Timpanaro Cardini, was a prominent historian of ancient Greek science, particularly mathematics, and a teacher in a liceo classico, kind of, very academic grammar school in Italy. His father, Sebastiano Timpanaro Sr., they had the same name, so there's also some daddy issues in formation here. You could see Sebastiano Timpanaro Sr. was a trained physicist who, crowded out of a career in teaching by the introduction of the fascist party card requirement, ended up paradoxically running the Domus Galileana in Pisa. And this is a kind of cultural institute for the history of science. And he got that job by special dispensation of none other than Giovanni Gentile, who was then director of the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. So Gentile was one of the intellectual architects of Italian fascism, a continuator of Hegelian idealism. And it was this kind of combined political philosophical orientation which Timpanato would spend his life combating with total ferocity and, in all honesty, visceral disgust. Timpanato's entire family joined the Italian Socialist Party after World War II, but it was perhaps his father's flirtation with this philosophical enemy of idealism that began to radicalize Timpanato as a lifelong materialist. Timpanato's parents were outsized influences on his intellectual formation in a positive as well as a negative sense. They also transmitted to him a feel for the history and value of science. Now, Glenn Most has nicely shown in the introduction to his translation of Timpanato's Genesis of Lachmann's method that the kind of intellectual history which marked the Timpanato approach, a history of method, was drawn actually more from the history of science than of philology. Timpanato's fairly uncritical admiration for science, enlightenment, and rationality comes out everywhere in his writing. Along with his grim-faced and unremitting atheism, Timpanato's faith in these principles should be viewed in the frame of a mid-20th century humanistic Italian culture, largely indifferent to, if not outright contemptuous of, science. Timpanato's famous work on materialism, on the left there, as well as his screed against Freud, titled The Freudian Slip, perhaps his most famous work, were both in different ways responses to what Timpanato saw as a very worrying betrayal of the spirit of Marxism in the 50s and 60s and 70s, leading it astray from its Enlightenment and scientific roots. Timpanato saw the new trends of Western Marxism, from Freud to the Frankfurt School, as all too fixated on the all-encompassing power of the human mind and subjectivity to the detriment of science. To Timpanato, Western Marxist reductions of science to mere ideology, a la Althusser, were, quite frankly, bullshit. Science, of course, was contoured by ideological forces. Timpanato admits this, but it was also a body of real results and a system of rigorous scrutiny, a core of content beyond ideology. So even if I remain mildly skeptical of Timpanato's positivist tending insistence on absolute truth and empirical reasoning, his contribution to contemporary leftist debates in the 60s and 70s was a kind of welcome antidote to the abstraction then inflecting Western Marxism. Timpanato's political project, in other words, was to stop Marxism disappearing up its own arse of intellectualism without empiricism. Timpanato's politics were somewhat heterodox for his age. His commitment to a militant Marxism was absolutely unswerving, and this militancy took place through active service to a series of socialist parties on the vociferous Italian left. So first, the PSI, the Partito Socialista Italiano, in the middle. He was in that from 1947 to 64. Then the PSI-UP, the Partito Socialista Italiano di Unità Proletaria, on the left there, and he was in that from 64 to 72. And then the PD-UP, the Partito di Unità Proletaria, from 1972 to 1976. So all of these were revolutionary socialist parties, although the first, the PSI, was certainly experiencing a dampening of the revolutionary fire and a practical edging towards reformism in the 50s, parallel with the party that outstripped it for members and votes in the post-war period, the most famous Italian leftist party, the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, which it's just worth bearing in mind for a second, had a membership of, at its peak, 2.3 million people, 2.3 million members in 1947, out of a population of, 45 million-ish. Okay, so this just gives you a sense of what was going on in Italy at the time. But Timpanato's position in the PSI was always very much on the left flank. And it was partly the creep of these mainstream left parties towards bureaucratization and reformism that sparked the breakoff of the PSI-UP in the mid-60s. In some ways, then, Timpanato's politics were in tune with much of the international New Left, which is a term we use to describe the sort of vague coalescence of forces reacting against the sclerotic direction of the old left parties in the 60s. But in other ways, Timpanato was atypical of the new left. He was skeptical of China and Mao at a moment in which many on the new left were looking east with a kind of willful blindness to the problems of Chinese socialism. He was very sympathetic to Trotsky at a moment in which Trotsky's stocks were fairly low. And generationally too, he was poised almost between the old and the new lefts. So in the student upheavals of 1968 and 1969, Timpanato was actually 45 or 46. So he very much wasn't a kind of, student emerging through that new left, that 68 generation. He was already kind of mature in a political sense by then. Okay, so despite those singularities, Timpanato adhered to a fairly straight version of Marxist-Leninist thought. But what made his Marxism particularly eccentric was the way his anachronistic love of enlightenment was welded to his deep bond with the poet Giacomo Leopardi. So this kind of generated a Marxism that weirdly incorporated within itself the limits of its own philosophy. Timpanato's Marxism, paradoxically for a philosophy of praxis, insisted on the passive state of human beings beneath a remorseless nature that would always screw them over in imposing insuperable limits of illness, old age, and death. For Timpanato, the materialist, a Marxist worldview was not just about asserting the determining power of economic structures upon human life, and hence the need to change them. There was also a layer of human existence even more determining than political economy, the harsh, pressing limits of the human as a finite biological being. Nature negatively conditioned human in ways that economic transformation could never touch. So even after the revolution, nature would still, in Leopardi's phraseology, be matrigna, the evil stepmother, making us all unhappy. So this might sound like a bit of a downbeat message that precisely no one needs to hear in 2023, when we have, so many other reasons to be pessimistic. But I think it's important to point out that Timpanato's famed pessimism was not born from the failure of the left. It was not originally a political pessimism. For Timpanato in his heyday, the triumph of socialism was beyond question. The only room for pessimism was in the things that socialism couldn't fix, could never fix, on account of the inherent limits of our human organism. Okay, so philologists historically have often only been interested in other philologists, qua philologists, and this accounts for why Timpanato's memory remains for classicists primarily as a philologist and a historian of philology. And Glenn Moe's introduction to Timpanato's Genesis of Lachmann's Method, which is a brilliant introduction and translation, but I think it perpetuates this same bias. It sort of sidelines Timpanato's more politically inflected output as something that is occasion-based, ephemeral, superannuated, as opposed to the philology which lasts. But Timpanato's political life was just as deeply felt and lived as his philological, if not more so. By his own declaration, in his political peak from the late 40s to the mid-70s, he often spent more time in meetings and demonstrations than in the study. Long and deep immersion in this culture, of course, left ingrained marks on Timpanato's way of thinking, but even throughout the noisiest uproar from the mid-60s to the early 70s, when Timpanato was at his greatest breadth and buzz as a political agent and thinker, he brought the philologist intellectual baggage into all his political activity and thought. So in this talk, I want to explore, for good or for ill, what that baggage contained, and I want to start to sketch the places Timpanato carried it, far, far beyond the cloisters in which philology is wont to fiddle. Okay, so Timpanato's philological output falls into a few different brands. First, there's the practice of philology pure and proper, as embodied in two collected volumes published relatively late in his career, but acting as kind of repositories of material which were in many instances released much earlier. These were the contributi, the contributions, okay, and the nuovi contributi. These are collections of articles on very specific targeted problems in classical philology. For example, the interpretation of a strange phrase in Virgil's eclogues, ut vidi, ut peri, or on the history of the Latin word illicet. Timpanato referred to these articles, these pieces, as ricerca puntuale, or esegesi puntuale, or adversaria, or the self-deprecating noterelle, little notes. And ricerca puntuale means something like, precision research, point research, focused on the resolution or thinking through of a very circumscribed snag in making sense of an ancient text. Next, there are two more discursive and extended works on the history of philology, both texts forming a complementary kind of metadisciplinary study on the evolution of the discipline in the 19th century and before. So the first of these, Timpanato's debut major work from 1955, is a focused account of the, on the left there, is a focused account of the philology of Giacomo Leopardi. So Timpanato's main thesis here was that this famous poet was not just or not purely a poet, as idealist interpreters or misinterpreters of Leopardi would hold. Rather, in the early part of his career, Leopardi was a philologist of the highest, most up-to-date order at a time when Italy kind of lacked these specimens. The second book on the right there, I've already mentioned it, is Timpanato's path-breaking 1963 genesis of Lachmann's method on the formation of a kind of rigorous system of manuscript classification attributed to Karl Lachmann, the German philologist in the 1810s and 1820s. Timpanato showed, with the most granular and subtle historical analysis, that this so-called method of Lachmann was really a cumulative result of many different individual philological contributions between the Renaissance and the early 19th century. So this was a testament to Timpanato's conviction on the longue durée progress of philology, a field of human endeavor subject to the laws of gradualist reformism rather than the kangaroo leaps of revolution. It's interesting the language he uses in this passage, and we're going to come back to it later. So we might be tempted to sequester these two works on the history of philology, in an altogether different category to the sort of minimalia of Timpanato's esegesi puntuale. The Lachmann, in particular, had a huge scholarly impact both in Italy and the Anglophone world. But in practice, the Pasqualian school of philology from which Timpanato came never really distinguished between these two kinds of enterprise, the big and the small. As Pasquale's 1934 magnum opus, Storia della Tradizione, had already established in writing, the practice of philology was inseparable from a self-conscious study of the history of its methods. Philology was also always its histories. Now, the last major strand of Timpanato's proper philological activity was another diptych of monographs on the Virgilian tradition of Antiquity, both relatively late works, 1986 and 2001, respectively. So the Virgilian tradition in Timpanato's purview was the late antique practice of commentary on the authoritative text of Virgil. And for Timpanato, it was a treasure trove of textual variants, sometimes pickled better than in the manuscripts of Virgil's actual poetry. Timpanato had an abiding interest in somewhat marginal grammarians like Valerius Probus his whole career, but he only treated them in earnest relatively late. And what these Virgilian tradition books allowed him to express, as we're going to see below, was a full working out of philology's case-by-case judgment. Its kind of inability to write anything off or treat anything as valueless, even these kind of underrated grammarians. So this radical democratism of evaluation, this ideal, at least, suspension of a priori prejudice, cashes out in much Timpanarian work. And it was philology that trained him in that sort of process of rehabilitating every neglected corner of intellectual history and in never taking anything for granted. Okay, so before we move on to some bigger points, it's worth noting briefly something that may be opaque to the uninitiated. And this is the philology that Timpanato didn't do or didn't quite do. Now, unquestionably, the summit goal of a philological career in Timpanato's mid-20th century Florowit was one thing: the production of an edition of, often with a commentary on, a given classical text. Such an enterprise was thought to require all the philologists' Herculean strength in many areas of labour, collating and organising manuscripts, recensio, deciding between textual variants, making informed conjectures about the form of the original text when such variants didn't yield ready sense or emendatio, and finally, often synthesizing the history of scholarship on the particular text to then offer one's own detailed interpretation of its form and content, its linguistic, and if it was poetry, its metrical oddities and typicalities. Timpanato never produced an exemplar of that kind of gold standard philology. And this was very strange. His undergraduate work poised him well to kind of trot out an authoritative edition of Rome's first major poet, Ennius. His older scholarly titans who Timpanato had a relationship with, like Eduard Frenkel, thought that he should apply his preternatural gifts to no less a flagship than the editing of Virgil. And in classical philology of that time, that was a sort of holy grail. But in the former case, in the case of Ennius, Timpanato's awareness that the leading London-based German scholar Otto Skutsch had an Ennius edition in the works kind of discouraged him from the prospect of doubling up. And in the latter case with Virgil, Frenkel's appeals fell on deaf ears, fobbed off by Timpanato's pathological pleading of incapacity and lack of patience. So the closest Timpanato came to producing an edition was actually outside the strict remit of academic philology. His much admired volume of Leopardi's philological writings, a kind of follow-up to La Filologia, co-edited with Giuseppe Pacella, whose presence Timpanato admitted was crucial to force him to bring this painstaking work to term. And that was published in 1969. And then also Timpanato did these popular translations of two critical Enlightenment in the broad sense texts, Cicero's On Divination and Holbach's Good Sense. Now, both of these latter texts, especially the Cicero, had the hallmarks of a kind of public-facing, accessible philological edition. So more than half their battle was in offering detailed explanatory notes, commentary to the uninitiated reader. And this was kind of by design of the series in which they appeared. This Italian publisher Garzanti specialized in textbooks and school reference works. But there was a reason Timpanato took those jobs on. They were, in a sense, the natural philological outgrowth of Timpanato's didactic impulse, honed in teaching teens and tweens in the 1950s when he taught in a middle school. And I think that experience as a teacher is absolutely crucial for Timpanato's entire output. He writes in this incredibly didactic way, not in a condescending way, but in a way that he never takes any information or knowledge for granted. And that's partly why he's such a pleasure to read. So Timpanato did indeed channel the iron gravity of his discipline's expectations into producing editions, but these editions were just kind of produced off-site, as it were, away from the intense glare of professional classical scholarship. But he remained almost ashamed of the fact he never generated a proper scholarly edition right to the end of his life, which sheds light on the minor writings of a philologist with no major works comment above. So what did that glaring philological lacuna, this missing edition, obstruct, and what did it enable? It was perhaps a very mild drag on Timpanato's reputation as a philologist. It was a gatekeeping slight his critics could throw at him to qualify the validity of some of his findings, particularly in his more synthetic history of classical scholarship works. In the genesis of Lachmann's method, for example, Timpanato made certain claims about the process of recension, the collating and classifying of manuscripts for a given text and their processing into a kind of family tree of genealogical relationships, without ever having actually done this work for any text. Such lack of experience left Timpanato open to accusations of overestimating the limitations of Lachmann's method, particularly in its most mathematically systematic incarnation in the work of Paul Mars. But if such a lack of edition could be a kind of Achilles heel among the arrow glances of bitchy professional philologists, it was also, from a wider perspective, an unmitigated boon to the world. Instead of spending 10, 20, even 30 years painstakingly plumbing the depths of a particular text and its tradition, Timpanato was free to read widely and peruse the history of philology synoptically. And since he could see clearly the best of its methods, he could put them to best practice, even beyond the confines of a field not so used to having its perimeter breached. Okay, so much for that overview of these forms of Timpanato philology, both what he did and what he didn't do. And next, I'd like to talk more thematically about some of Timpanato's specific obsessions within this philology. Top of my list is something that Timpanato could never leave alone: conjecture. Conjecture, very briefly, is, and sorry if this is repeating familiar material, but I also don't want to take too much for granted. So conjecture is the practice of suggesting a change to a classical text, usually at the level of an individual word, which is unattested in extant manuscripts of that text. So this may not sound like much, and perhaps it isn't, but conjecture as a practice, believe it or not, is actually one of the most contentious topics in the history of classical philology. Its range, its bounds are in almost constant dispute across time, and its triumph, or conversely constraint, come to define both philological nations and epochs. On the philological axis, radicals are those who tend to make no bones about making their own interventions into a classical text. And those interventions are often in the form of conjectures. And then conservatives, on the other hand, are those who respect the form furnished by the manuscript tradition and invest in manuscript authority as the only sort of empirical guarantor, or at least the approximator of editorial truth. So since philology is a kind of human science, its technical toolkit straddles both art and science, poetic creativity, and sober rationalism. And the radicals often channel the spirit of the former, the conservatives the latter. So the Overton window of acceptable conjecture is kind of shifting over time and between these national traditions. For example, the arrogant English, which was Timpanato's term for English philology, these guys sort of embody the absolute extreme of conjecture-happy behavior. Their leading lights, such as Richard Bentley and A.E. Houseman, winning fame for bold and inspired conjectures that, according to Timpanato, sometimes risk outdoing or improving the writers that they claim to be merely fixing. So the fundamental question at issue here is who has the right to fiddle with the historical given of a classical text and its imperfect tradition, and under what terms and what limits? Philologists tend to pick corners on this question and fight trenchantly in their nooks of choice. Few things fly them more. Timpanato's politics may be radical by many measures, but on this seemingly minor philological question, he's certainly skewed towards conservative. His earliest, most formative philological experience with the text of Ennius made him extremely cautious treading the speculative ground of conjecture, because Ennius was a poet subject to particularly abject abuses of scholarly license. So no manuscripts containing complete sections of Ennius's poetry survive. Rather, only fragments of his verse, often no longer than a single line, have come down to us via quotation in other later texts. And this was a classic example of the value of the indirect tradition Timpanato would come to respect so deeply in the case of Virgil, perhaps partly because in Ennius's case, it wasn't just a kind of help or supplement to the textual tradition, but literally its lifeline, sustaining the only surviving parts of Ennius's shattered corpus. But since Ennius, on account of his extreme fragmentation, lacked the quantity of text to furnish resolutions of textual problems by the standard principle of usus scribendi, the habit of the writer, i.e. what the author wrote elsewhere, and since his verse also appeared embedded in less luminous texts, which are more subject to scholarly entitlement to intervene, the sport of conjecture on this poet was particularly dangerous. Timpanato was cautioned by this and didn't like it at all. So it was here, kind of deep in these weeds of philological work on a poet in this right textual state, that Timpanato developed his aversion to what he vilified as arbitrary rifacimento, this point at which the sometimes necessary art of conjecture passes over into the all-out restoration or rebuilding of a text. So in this sandpit, Timpanaro developed a deep suspicion of originality and ingeniousness. He became absolutely scathing about the brilliant virtuoso conjecture, particularly in the English philological tradition, and such skepticism towards the glitteringly original intervention would actually later extend to his suspicion over the two brilliant interpretations of Freudian analysis in the Freudian slip, or in spin-offs in Freudian literary criticism. So he attacked that brilliance in the Freudian slip. And this is, I don't have time to go into it today, but it's an absolutely brilliant and hilarious book. Probably wrong about psychoanalysis, but just amazing. And it's a sort of book that uses the tools of philology to kind of hold psychoanalysis to ransom. And we can, talk about that a bit in the discussion. Anyway, what's more, toward this antipathy towards conjecture, if not a causal determinant or seed of Timpanaro's later thought on subjectivity and materialism, was at least an early manifestation of the same fundamental principles governing such thought. These crucial Timpanaran concepts that the individual human subject was not entitled to generate its own reality, and that such external reality, like the extant manuscripts and knowledge of parallel passages limiting the philologist's budding conjectures, formed an insurmountable break on any transcendent power of human creativity to bend or make the world its way. History often outflanked agency. Timpanaro explicitly confronts the problem of conjecture very early in his career. Delle Congetture on Conjectures hails from 1953, and this piece clearly draws on some of Timpanaro's crystallizing work on the philological activity of the young Leopardi, which bears fruit in the full monograph of 1955. So already in the 1953 piece, Timpanaro is characteristically suspicious of the humanist tendency of scholars such as Emil Behrens and the early Girolamo Vitelli to embellish passages of ancient texts through conjecture, defacing even healthy texts liberally via the principle of mallem scripsisset. I'd prefer that the author had written it that way. Hostile to such artistic and arbitrary injections of the critic's ego into the text, Timpanaro is rather attracted to the ideal practice of a more scientific historical philologist, who subjects the intuitive element of making conjectures to limiting factors, wide knowledge of the language of a given historical period, of the style of a given author, of the history of the transmission of ancient texts, both generally and in particular. These limiting factors become a kind of structure of accountability to keep the philologist honest, to rein in an impulsive genius threatening to cross the boundary from scientific research on into artistic collaboration with these vulnerable, long-dead authors. Best philological practice keeps human subjectivity in check and balance. So this conviction in the right kind of conjecture is borne out throughout Timpanaro's works on philology and the history of philology. Timpanaro's work on Leopardi's philology is largely tasked with separating out Leopardi's poetic subjectivity from his activity as a hard-nosed philologist. He is more conjecturer scientist than conjecturer artist in Timpanaro's book. Timpanaro also strenuously objects to Nietzsche's, what he thinks is a naive unification of Leopardi the philologist with Leopardi the poet. So denying that kind of unity between those enterprises works for Timpanaro as a justification for the very possibility of one's philology having nothing to do with the rest of one's life. But this binary at the level of conjecturer, the scientist versus the artist, also comes to inform one of Timpanaro's most defining philological conflicts in the 80s. So Timpanaro's work on the tradition of Virgilian commentators in late antiquity was partly aroused by the local spark of Jim Zetzel's 1981 Latin textual criticism in Antiquity, which argued that these ancient grammarians were at base unscrupulous philologists fudging and faking their way into guardianship of the canon. In Zetzel's view, the grammarians may have claimed to be preserving Virgilian text, but often they were just making it up, inserting their own conjectures without marking them as such. For Timpanaro, this was baseless slander of the poor, dutiful incubators of the Virgilian tradition. They weren't smuggling in conjectures. They were merely deciding between textual variants in circulation. These ancient scholars did make some conjectures, but they were also, according to Timpanato, very conservative. The core of this spat was about whether these ancients were licensed or felt licensed to make stuff up as they liked. And Zetzel thought yes, and Timpanato thought no. But perhaps this wasn't just a dual act of imagining ancient scholars in their respective own images, as Zetzel noted, but a testament to the very different national traditions and contexts of conjecture in which these two found themselves doing the imagining. Crudely put, the Anglo-American right to meddle and invent squared up against this Italian injunction to collate and preserve. Timpanato's philology couldn't abide this, what he felt was a particularly Anglophone appetite for innovation. In fact, the kind of conjecture that Timpanato increasingly gravitates towards over his career is the conjecture that is least original. Least original in the sense that it has been suggested before, somewhere in the long and deep history of scholarship, or in the sense that it gets confirmed by a subsequent manuscript discovery. And so in the fullness of time, a kind of human individual's guesswork is confirmed as already sort of there in the textual past. Timpanato seizes on many cases of both these kinds of conjecture in the career of his beloved Leopardi. And he himself, Timpanato himself, experienced the first kind, finding his conjecture already proposed by a philologist predecessor firsthand, which experience made him think of conjecture as a kind of derivation of an unoriginal result, something multiple people could arrive at given certain constraining data, a little like the ideal replicability of the scientific method itself. So if August Burke famously coined philology the knowledge of what has been known, Timpanato took this to heart in valuing a kind of intellectual practice whose objectivity was all the greater for its unoriginality. If a conjecture passed from an individual stab to an intersubjective approximation converged on by two or more people over time, well, all the better to admit it into the text. So this almost sublime experience of losing priority in intellectual history, of not being the first to suggest something, an experience very typical of good conjecturers, became a reference point for Timpanato across his career. He actually pointed to it in his own experience, for example, by giving due credit to the linguist Rudolf Mehringer, who he wrote about in this book, The Roman Phobia and other writings on Freud and Mehringer. And he gave credit to Rudolf Mehringer for anticipating a lot of Timpanato's arguments by about 50 years, anticipating many of the points Timpanato made in the Freudian slip. So Timpanato's scholarship was drawn to moments when other thinkers had been pipped from priority. For example, in the genesis of Lachmann's method, Timpanato shows how that had a long gestation of precursors. So for Timpanato, good conjecture and good ideas didn't reveal the boundless virtuosity of the human mind, but the limits of our intellect, constantly reinventing the wheel to arrive at a pedestrian truth over and over again. Nothing should be created from nothing. The history of conjectural philology then becomes a perfect petri dish for a materialist in the making. Okay, anti-conjecturalism, or we might call it brilliant conjecturalism, is one aspect of Timpanato's philology he carries with him into the wider intellectual world. But let's end with a sketch of a few more principles he learned on the philologist job. I think the first would be a feel for particularity and small details. So Timpanato embodies this in the type of philology he praises in theory. He calls it Hermannian, after German philologist Johann Gottfried Jakob Hermann, which is a kind of detail-heavy, details-based, pointed formal philology, eschewing the more Olympian vistas of the Burkean, after August Burke, who I mentioned above. But also Timpanato kind of practices details philology. He puts this details philology into practice, not just in theory. So he describes his contributi as scrittarelli molto aridi e disorganici. Okay, so little writings, very dry and disorganic. And as I said before, he apologizes for his history of producing mere noterelle, these little notes, rather than an organic volume. He does down his own philological accomplishments in comparison with the more sweeping work of Italian philologist contemporaries like Antonio La Penna, Alfonso Trainas, Scevola Mariotti, and Franco Munari, who in Timpanaro's view managed to produce more synthetic or organic work. In fact, this polarity of the bitty versus the whole, the disorganic versus the organic, becomes not only a habitual way in which Timpanaro self-deprecatingly positions his work next to his contemporaries, but also a way of pitching an ideal of the relation of the individual, both to its historical context and to itself. Timpanaro resists the grip of the Gramscian fetish for the organic intellectual embedded neatly in a social class. He expends a lot of intellectual energy showing the often progressive function of inorganic intellectuals, such as Leopardi, who stand at a kind of oblique angle to their societies. And Timpanaro wrote about this a lot in his 1965 classic, Classicismo e Illuminismo. So this refusal to kind of cohere with oneself or one's surroundings is one of Timpanaro's most salient and powerful philological techniques. For Timpanaro, splitting is always preferable to lumping, and philology's special mode of inorganic splitting down to the individual follicle and whatever is inside that is the model for how it should be done. Timpanaro's philology is also about a sort of case-by-case methodology, as I said before, an ideal of weighing every problem and person without a prioristic prescription stacking the decks. And that comes out clearest in his later work on the Virgilian indirect tradition. So here, a heavy scholarly bias against late antique commentators and compilers meant many genuine textual readings in Virgil had been unjustifiably discounted. Timpanaro revels in examining each of these possibilities on its individual merits and recuperates many particular variants, as well as cumulatively salvaging the general reputability of the indirect tradition containing them. But though the full efflorescence of that anti-a priorism arrives relatively late in those pieces on the Virgilian tradition, its basic stance was seeded much earlier for Timpanaro. So one of the biggest take-homes of Giorgio Pasquale's philology was this old principle of recentiores non deteriores, the more recent, not necessarily the worse. In a nutshell, when it comes to the constitution of an edition of a text, more recent manuscripts shouldn't be considered necessarily inferior to older manuscripts. So through the possibility of horizontal cross-contamination, more recent manuscripts can preserve better readings than their more ancient cousins. Such a principle, again, may sound minor, but it was quietly radical in the context of responding to a kind of strict mathematizing philology hellbent on eliminating as many derivative manuscripts as possible from the process of constituting a text. Pasquale and others' contribution was to step in and say, hold it, not so fast. The messiness of the textual tradition means that almost no manuscript can be automatically ruled out of consideration. That general guideline was a rejoinder to this methodological overreach embodied by the followers and purifiers of Karl Lachmann, particularly Paul Mars, whose mode of reasoning, according to Timpanaro and Pasquale, was far too rigid for the mess of the material world that hosted transmission of manuscripts. But there was also a kind of politics here. As a statement of philological egalitarianism, no manuscript is valueless, no manuscript left behind. Recentiores non deteriores was crucial in sealing Timpanaro's method of anti-a priorism, of sort of taking nothing for granted. Timpanaro transferred that principle of reading and redeeming the written off into all of his subsequent intellectual work. The earliest and most powerful expression of this recuperative method would have to be, as I've already mentioned, the genesis of Lachmann's method. The genesis is Timpanaro's great fulfillment of his best version of Enlightenment philology. It apportions credit where credit is due, and in the process, it kind of lifts these neglected miners behind an intellectual revolution into the limelight. The project is partly motivated by a kind of resentment at a historical injustice. Karl Lachmann ended up getting all the love for a method that shouldn't be assigned solely to him. In Timpanaro's words, the fame of Lachmann obscured other contributors to the method. And so it's high time for Timpanaro's bright Enlightenment laser to beam the others out of the shade. Timpanaro had already prepared the ground for this kind of redemptive redistributive project with La Filologia. And the hero of that book was Giacomo Leopardi, whose philological contributions were still yet to be tabulated and celebrated. And the villain was actually Angelo Mai, curator of the Ambrosian and subsequently Vatican Library, Leopardi's nemesis and Timpanaro's philological antitype, an unscrupulous appropriator who stole conjectures from Leopardi and others without a hint of acknowledgement. But what La Filologia does to restore the balance of credit between certain individual actors in 19th century philology, La Genesi does for our intellectual history of an entire philological method. Timpanaro's book pours cold water over the genius model of intellectual history, cuts the big names down to size, and elevates the lesser known names like Zumpt, Ritschl, Sauper, and Bernays. In this devastating redimensioning of individual contributions to the history of scholarship, the Genesis scales back the power of originality, just as Timpanaro had done for conjecture. In a field like philology, there were no shuddering revolutions in method, merely a series of inchings forward whose granularity was fast lost to the simplifications of retrospective intellectual history. And that's what partly this passage talks about: gradualistic advancement without epistemological ruptures. So if these studies in the history of philology honed Timpanaro's ethics of redistributive justice, they were also attempts at correcting the past. Both Timpanaro's day jobs, philology and proofreading, trafficked heavily in the concept of error. In philology, patterns of error were the things that enabled manuscript collation, as well as the bumps to spot and smooth out. And in proofreading, errors were, of course, the things to weed out too. But for Timpanaro, errors are not just verbal slips to sort out. They are also deep misdirections in intellectual history, wrong turns needing the full address of constant correction. Timpanaro gets this impulse from philology, especially, I would say, the manic drive to self-correction. So one of his most distinctive features as a thinker is the depth of the revisions he applied over the course of his career to almost all of his own major contributions. Timpanaro despised stubbornness and inflexibility in other scholars, and over the course of his life, he remained ever encouraging of challenges to his arguments, and that was another Pasqualian trait, this sort of courting of obsolescence via robust debate. And many times these challenges led to full recantations when Timpanaro saw that he was clearly wrong. The last edition of the Genesis actually capitulated to Michael Reeve on the subject of bipartite stemmata in textual transmission. So this kind of obscure question of why most manuscript family trees tend to split into two main branches rather than other numbers, say 3. And Timpanaro sort of disowned that to the point where he actively resisted Glenn Moh's proposal to do an English edition of the Genesis because he thought the book was definitively superannuated, ready to be put to bed, just dead, over, gone. The Contributi are also full of significant revisions to early philological pieces, even containing a full section, Ripensamenti Enniani, Ennian Rethinkings, devoted to this rethinking of Timpanaro's earliest Ennius work. So Timpanaro's publications, like many of his correspondence chains, are works that never stop being in progress. Countless of his letters sign off with this, quite common tag in Italian, but very Timpanaran, "Ma ne riparleremo," but we'll come back to it. We'll talk about it again. And this kind of implicit signature could be added sensibly to any given piece of published Timpanaran text as well. So while many other scholars, probably including myself, would simply write the book or article and be done with it, Timpanaro feels this constant obligation to remodel his former conclusions by taking new evidence and arguments into account. It's as if, in the throes of endless rounds of rigorous self-scrutiny, he seeks to model the distinctive shape of philology as that science of slow and halting progress. For ultimately, philology furnishes Timpanaro not just with an intellectual toolkit or a disciplined way of seeing the world. It also gives him a particular reference point for how history works beyond the standard drivers of class struggle and revolution, which form the crutches of Marxist discourse. As we've seen, the introduction to the Contributi contains an ode to the basic unoriginality and incrementalism of philology. It's a field spurred not by giant methodological leaps forward, but by incremental scratching away at certain particulars. Often it's required to dust off old interpretations and defend them with new fodder. As the Latinist Harry Josselin says of Timpanaro's style in his Ancient Virgilian Tradition book, detailed arguments usually confirm an old consensus. Alternatively, sometimes philology can be ahead of its time in offering an interpretation that will eventually be dusted off and then dusted off again. So this gradualism forms a backbone of Timpanaro's attunement to all the models of history which are not dialectical progress. The longue durée reformist rather than revolutionary advances in the treatment of biological illness, always buying us time, but never really making a dent in the hard limit of human mortality, or the slow and bumpy evolution of thought within an individual over time, what Timpanaro says about Leopardi's move to cosmic pessimism. Philology in its history is this kind of paradigm for a logic of snail-paced, modest human progress, hammered out beyond the bolts and jolts of revolution. A progress often contingent precisely on a timely salvaging of the old and neglected. And as the prospect of actual revolution within a brief term retreated from political life, and Timpanaro decided to dust off a neglected Leopardi to revive a Marxism flagging beneath this frustrating reality, it's not hard to see where the principle of eternal relevance came from. None other than the art of Pasqualian philology, where nothing ever is declared dead and buried. Perhaps we could even say this, that philology can give a framework to guarantee that Marxism will never go out of date, because it guarantees that those big ideas will be revived and revived again. This field of small things gave this weird 20th century intellectual a way of thinking through various problems that would become the core of his broader non-philological work. The abuses of conjecture wise Timpanaro up to the limits of human subjectivity and the dangers of excessive ingenuity. Philology in general furnished Timpanaro a field for the case-by-case, an analogy to the a priori, an egalitarianism of treating evidence, a field for the miners of intellectual history, and a will to give the neglected their dues, a practice of restless self-revision that never considered the case closed, a sense that no ideas and no past could ever fully be discarded. But philology also gave this heterodox Marxist a way of apprehending that history itself, particularly the history of ideas, sometimes plays out very slowly. Sometimes a return to old ideas paradoxically means progress if the old ideas remain true. Timpanaro was fond of quoting Verdi's old maxim, "Torniamo all'antico e sarà un progresso." Let's return to the past and it'll be progress. But that sentiment was deeply philological. Philology furnished Timpanaro with a mode of reviving the past, a way of renewing the truth of old ideas, and at the same time, a technique for making corrections to them. In that, Timpanaro was, like his darling Leopardi, both ahead of and behind his times. And maybe, if I can have some small thing to do with it, his moment has come again. Thanks very much for listening. And I'm sorry I went a little bit over time. It always takes less time when you're doing it at home.
Wow, that was absolutely fantastic and so worth the extra time you took. So thanks for doing
that. Yeah.
My mind's brimming with thoughts and questions. I'm glad we have some time for questions. So as is our usual practice, if you could stick a Q in the chat, we'll call on you to ask your question of Tom. So if there are any questions fresh off the line, let us know, and if not, I'll be happy because I have a question that I want to ask. Okay, I'm diving in. Thanks so much, Tom. So I know you kind of put to one side for another discussion, more depressing discussion, the way that nature kind of looms so large in Timpanaro's thinking about the limits of reform or revolution within kind of political economic life. I want to kind of see a parallel between what you've suggestively talked about there and then what you've elaborated on wonderfully in the rest of the talk in the realm of philology, And so I wanted to try it on you and tell me if you think there's anything to this.
Yeah.
Is there a kind of parallel in the way that Timpanaro sees the manuscript tradition constraining the philologist's activity, and the way he thinks that nature or our biological material life kind of constrains our political activity, and that in setting up the discussion in those terms, he's trying to caution the philologist who is much more conjectural in his engagement with the text, and on the other, the ardent revolutionary and radical who thinks that we can just, revolt our way to perfection or something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of nailed what I didn't quite make clear, and I need to make a note of that to bring it out a bit more. But yeah, I think there's absolutely a parallel, and the language that he uses between some of his philology and on materialism, this language of kind of conditioning or limit or constraint, it's the same kind of language, right? So I think there is, I think that sort of example of the manuscript tradition as something that is kind of there, for Timpanaro, that's like a given, and it is, it forms this kind of constraint that needs to be worked with, but we don't have the license to kind of intervene or change that willy-nilly. I think that is the model for some of his thinking about materialism. I would only say that I would only sort of reiterate what I mentioned briefly, but Timpanaro did remain, the way I've presented some of his politics in this talk, like, you could probably accuse him of an element of crypto-conservatism or whatever, right? But actually he remained a dedicated revolutionary towards the end, until the end, right? So his pessimism, I think, was purely about, when he wrote on materialism, his pessimist materialism was about sort of stopping Marxism making claims that it couldn't follow through on. Okay, so this idea that, like, after the revolution, we're gonna live in this happy utopian climate and everyone's gonna live till age 300 because like socialism will have solved all of these things. He's like, absolutely bloody not. That's complete bullshit. And his thought, I think, resonates so beautifully in this kind of modern, like, Silicon Valley optimist context of, like, there are no limits to the biological organism of the human, and we can actually, like, just kind of mortality is just like a hack that we need to, like, get over. Timpanaro was sort of like, trying to build into Marxism the limits of its promises, I suppose. So that's kind of what he was doing with that. So yeah, I wouldn't, I think he was still, I guess it's a bit of, like, optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect or whatever. He would, he still, like, really believed that revolution was the answer, and socialism was the answer, but it was just about sort of cordoning off this bit that Marxism couldn't touch, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. And it makes him an interesting contributor to a kind of tradition of biopolitics and Italian biopolitics then as well. But that's for another.
Totally. Yeah.
So there's a few more questions. So Ika, I'll throw to you. I'm going to skip Ben because he has privileges that need to be put away with.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was fantastic, and I'm so glad I was able to be here in the end.
God bless mysterious.
I had a mysterious calendar entry saying philology talk, and I asked Twitter what it was, and Tom jumped on and said, "I think it might be me." So that was a brilliant thing, and I couldn't be happier. That was fascinating. I'm wondering if maybe in the book or now. I'm wondering if one of the things you might be doing is bringing Timpanaro into conversation with some of the kind of contemporary, kind of liberation philologists. I'm thinking of people like Michelle Warren at Dartmouth, who did a really lovely special issue on the kind of on post-colonial politics and philology. Sheldon Pollock, the Sanskrit scholar, who's a kind of big philology, and of course Werner Hammacher's 95 Theses on Philology, which came out recently. And I think there's also a kind of just thinking about the kind of critical theory piece of this. I think there's also a strand in there's a kind of scholar who's not well enough known in critical theory, I think, called John Mowat, who wrote a fantastic book called Text, which engages with the kind of the French crew, the Tel Quel group, and some of the work that he does there kind of puts that tradition of critical textual analysis in conversation with philology as well. So, and I think everything that you're saying about Tim Panaro is like, yes, he needs to be restored to this conversation. So I wondered if that was something you were kind of doing.
Yeah, it's interesting that, thank you so much, Ika. They were great. I've engaged with Sheldon Pollock stuff, but some of the other references I'll have to give you, I'll have to get from you afterwards. But that was sort of originally part of the framing of the project, to sort of like engage with this this neo-philology or return to philology, and I kind of hope, I don't know where along the way I sort of lost a bit of track of that. I think it's like, my sort of slightly monomaniac one-track mind sort of like got really deep in the weeds on Tim Panaro. But I'm gonna mention that stuff in the preface and the introduction. I guess, the thing about Tim Panaro is you've got to sort of be, I guess you've got to be careful of which traditions you put him next to, because he's sort of, in some ways, like he embodies some of like the uncomfortable and like problematic part of classical traditional philology that I've always like that I've always sort of been at war with almost, and he, it was like it was such a funny feeling sort of sitting down to write this book, because I thought of what Tim Panaro would think of my own work, and I realized that he would think it would be absolutely bullshit. Like it was, he would just not think that this was like, solid empirical stuff. So, I think, sort of putting him in dialogue with like the Tel Quel group, which, Tim Panaro himself is like completely scathing about French theorists.
I bet,
It's like, he's, and he has read some of this stuff. It's not like he's just sort of like doing it, out of lack of knowledge, but he's sort of, he just hates structuralism. He hates post-structuralism. He's sort of like, those are some of the traditions or traditions in formation that he's forming himself against in the 60s and 70s. So I don't know. I think definitely like the sort of neo-philology stuff, and the post-colonialism, that would be really interesting, because Tim Panaro's politics were actually very he was very attentive to like anti-colonial movements. In fact, like some of the political meetings he was at in the 60s and 70s, didn't really talk about Italian stuff. They talked about like anti-colonial movements in the so-called New World. So I think there's more scope for putting him in dialogue with that stuff. But then I've got to be careful what I do with the Frenchies.
For sure. And I should kind of clarify and say, when I say dialogue, I mean kind of antagonistic dialogue. Like,
yes, antagonistic dialogue for sure.
In particular is, and Barth defines himself against philology a lot of the time. He is like, the text of the structuralists and the text of the philologists are different things. Anyway.
That's great. Thank you. That makes sense.
All right, we'll talk more, I'm sure. Thanks so much, Tom. This was fantastic.
Thanks, Ika.
I'll throw next to Harriet Furtick, and then I think I'll let Ben ask the closing question.
Thank you so much, and hello from Columbus, Ohio, from the past. I think is where I currently am. I actually was going to ask a different question when I put that cue in, but now another one has come to me based on your response to the last one. which is I was really struck by this moment in the first passage that you showed, where Timpanaro is sort of lamenting his lack of a unitary personality.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was really finding that interesting for thinking about scholarship for those of us who are sort of trained in classics as sort of traditionally constituted. You know, I do my this, and I also do my other thing over here, and sort of the effort to create a narrative in all kinds of different contexts of what your intellectual project is. And I'm wondering if Timpanaro can help us sort of think through, maybe not sort of how to do that, but why is it that we want to offer that sort of unitary self?
Yeah, absolutely. The unitary, but thank you so much. Yeah, the unitary personality stuff is very interesting, because it, you know, among Timpanaro's letters, that's like one of the more common things that he says about himself. That like, you know, he's got these kind of sides, these compartments, which, you know, which can't really be properly put together. And I think, like, you know, classicists, you know, academics nowadays, there is a search for unity between like scholarship and politics and, you know, and being, right? Like we want to be whole beings, and we don't want to just like sort of siphon off these different sides of ourselves. I think what I was trying to do with Timpanaro is sort of read him a little bit against the grain on that front, because, and this is another reason why he would have hated me, but like, you know, what I'm trying to do is, you know, is to show how that philological training like does come through into a worldview, into interventions into politics. So it's almost saying, you know, despite himself, you know, he does bring philology, you know, to the world outside philology, as it were. Yeah, and incidentally, just one more thing, he this kind of fierce maintenance of a juxtaposed of elements juxtaposed within the self rather than unified. This is part of Timpanaro's absolute resistance to what he sees as the dialectic. So he thinks that Marxism is completely tainted by a Hegelian dialectic inheritance, which kind of allows intellectual sleight of hand to say that, you know, this thing is actually its opposite, or these opposites are two, you know, dialectically linked, fundamentally linked things. He's like absolutely sort of anti that. He's sort of like all about, you know, letting these two, you know, he's all about exploring relationships beyond dialectical synthesis, if that makes sense, and just going for, you know, just kind of letting conflicts exist and juxtapositions exist without having to kind of, you know, turn them into a unity. So yeah, it's not, you know, the way he comments on himself is also the way he thinks about the world, is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, that's probably not, I wasn't helpful in like, does it help us become more unitary people? But anyway, I'll leave that for now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think we should let Ben ask his question, although he's told me it can wait, but I think you should ask your question, Ben.
No, it's a longish question, and I see that
they're your questions. But you should ask it. It's all right. We'll take another 5 minutes.
I don't have to reply. You can just, you know, say you do.
Okay. Well, I mean, I've got there's a lot I can ask. I mean, it seems to me what you're saying is that Timpanaro is suggesting that there are no kind of revolutionary moments, not just simply in philology and the history of philology, but rather a sort of a series of incremental sort of involution. So one goes back to things, rediscovers things, updates it, and so on. And it's interesting that I'm wondering whether there's a parallel to be found in a kind of Marxian notion of the development of the means, or the mode of the means of production, or productive forces. You know, who's responsible for the productive forces that cause revolutionary moments, right? I mean, there isn't anyone, right? It's like, so who's responsible? There's a sort of to use a figure that you've used yourself, there's a sort of anonymity, isn't there, to human progress as such. It sounds to me too like you're saying that Timpanaro is a kind of scientific optimist, even though he represented himself as a pessimist, that he was a scientific optimist. In other words, there is a thing called progress. It's just that it's not made by heroic figures who stride across the who are along the top of the water. There's a sort of more longue durée. I'm thinking of Brodel's metaphor of the ocean, that there's sort of deep currents where everyone's being pulled along. And I particularly like that notion of history out trumping agency. Was that your expression before? Yeah, I mean, that's a deeply, as a historian, I'm just utterly convinced of that. And I think that this idea of human agency, which is a sort of fiction of our own subjectivity, needs to be kind of put into this context. So that then what does it mean in terms of the close reading of text? Okay, so my question. I told you it should wait. What does Timpanaro have to say about Nietzsche?
Yeah, okay. So he doesn't engage with him that much in what I've read. This brief reference that I made in the talk was to what Nietzsche says about Leopardi, and Timpanaro doesn't like this because Nietzsche sort of, obviously, famously, Nietzsche sort of hates philologists, or the kind of like traditional nitpicking philologists.
But he loves Leopardi.
He loves Leopardi, so he points to Leopardi as this kind of sublime unity of the philologist and the poet. But Timpanaro, again, to come back to this, this idea of separation, Timpanaro says that's absolutely not true. Like, his Leopardi's philological activity was not poetic. It was like the driest, most scientific German brand of philology, like then, available. So it's sort of like, I'd say his view on Nietzsche there is like, yet again, this kind of like pointing out wishful thinking about the world. This is Nietzsche wanting to make Leopardi into, some kind of example, but actually, like, if you delve down into the specifics and you actually read Leopardi's philology and his poetry, they're not that connected. So that, that's the singular point in which I've seen Nietzsche come up, but he certainly like doesn't refer to Nietzsche regularly. Like Nietzsche's not like.
But at the same time, I mean, I guess I'm also thinking in terms of the comparability of their activities, right? So Timpanaro is also acting on the impulse that the philological habit propels you towards something beyond philology, right?
Yeah.
And Nietzsche is most definitely doing. I mean, Nietzsche is the kind of he is the poster boy for trying to make all of your other activities in life philological, while at the same time, leaving philology behind.
Totally, yeah. But I think, I guess I would say that Timpanaro is sort of a bit in denial about that, or he doesn't, he wants to maintain this strict difference, but like he doesn't acknowledge the philological baggage that comes into the rest of his life. So that's what I'm saying about sort of reading him a little bit against the grain, and like maybe from what you're saying, I'm sort of reading him in a kind of Nietzschean way, I guess.
Well, I'll end on something though that I thought was particularly striking, which is something that you said at the very beginning, and I think is something that really warrants sort of greater thought, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. But of course, you contrasted what he was doing with somebody like Geoffrey de Saint-Croix, or someone like George Thomson, who wants to make philology Marxist, right?
Yes, exactly.
And it just shows the utter error of that, right?
Well, I wouldn't be so hardline about that, but like I think this is.
Well, Saint-Croix was a heroic failure in that regard.
Yes, true. But I think Timpanaro was particularly remarkable for this reason, because there were so many examples among his contemporaries, among his closest friends and colleagues, like Antonio La Perna, who were trying to do Marxian ancient history and Marxist readings of classical texts, like doing a sort of Gramscian hegemonic reading of Sallust or whatever. Like these, this was happening at the time, but Timpanaro was so resistant. For him, philology was kind of like this pure space into which, which couldn't sort of be fused with Marxism in that way. You couldn't put Marxism into philology. But the argument in my book is that you when you've been trained as a philologist, you inevitably take philology into Marxism. So maybe that's a good note.
Because philology is science, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And they can converge on that front. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
This has been a great session. I've loved it. Thanks so much for sharing your work, Tom. And thanks everyone for coming. That's it for semester 1 now. Look forward to welcoming you back in August. We're going to have the wonderful and celebrated historian of political thought, Patricia Springborg, kicking us off on the 31st of August. It's talking about Hobbes and the reception of antiquity through the Islamic tradition, which is going to be amazing. So I hope you guys can come back then. But for now, please just thank Tom again for this great talk.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you all, and thanks for the questions. Cheers, guys.